I, of course, am not Andy Johns. He, of course, is not Daniel Craig. He's just David Craig. Andy had an unfortunate and unforeseen family issue come up, so I am the chair to spare. But what an appropriate panel. Chester, Luke, and David, this is a session that I was really looking forward to attending anyhow, so now I have the honor of chairing it. I'll give some quick introductions. We'll keep it to 12 to 15 minutes each. I won't have much to say, and then we'll open up to audience questions. So one other kind of housekeeping note, and sorry I have your biographies in 3 different places here. One other housekeeping note. On the program we have it listed, Luke, David, Luke, Chester, and David?
Yeah.
We're going to adjust that listing a little bit. It's going to be Luke, David, Chester. And you'll understand why once they give their papers. It makes more sense. But starting here with Luke Griffith. Luke is a professor of history and government at New Mexico Junior College. He studies U.S. foreign policy, nuclear arms control, NATO, and other issues in the Cold War. After earning his PhD from Ohio University with Chester Pack, Luke had fellowships at Rand and, more importantly, the Reagan Institute, where Luke and I were fellows together, enjoying many cups of coffee on my front porch, since we were not allowed to convene in the offices. Again, thanks to that pandemic. He is now presenting part of his forthcoming book, December 15th. December 15th. If you're in Washington, D.C., we can have a book launch for Luke. For his forthcoming book, Unraveling the Gray Area Problem, the United States and the INF Treaty, Cornell University Press. And he'll be giving a little selection of that book. Next up, David Craig.
Not Daniel.
Not Daniel. Your biography is a little easier to read, though, because of it. David conducts research and teaches courses on global and national media industries and creator culture through the lens of political economy, cultural production, and creator studies. His scholarship and coursework operate at the level of the global, regional, national, and the intersection of political economy, cultural production, and platform studies, mapping the progression of 20th century film and television into the emerging competition of streaming video platforms. He has published 3 books and over 24 articles about global and Chinese creator industries, whether referred to as social media entertainment or Wangang. He's the co-director of the Dual Masters program in global communication in partnership with the London School of Economics, and was recently a visiting scholar at Harvard University from 2023 to, you're still a visiting scholar,
I'm on my way.
2024.
I didn't write that bio.
And David, of course, is here to give a selection from his forthcoming book, Apocalypse TV, detailing the origins and the responses to that hit television movie, The Day After. And on to Chester. Professor Pack teaches history at Ohio University, and one of the most popular courses that he teaches is the United States in the 1980s, the age of Reagan and Madonna, of course. He has published 2 essays on Reagan in the past few months. One is Ronald Reagan's Noble Causes, and that essay he actually wrote for us. And we were so glad to have it, about Reagan's speech to the veterans of foreign wars in August 1980. It's part of the online essays on presidential principles and beliefs that we host on our website. The other that he most recently authored is The Long Goodbye, Mourning and Remembering Ronald Reagan, in the book Mourning the President's Loss and Legacy in American Culture. And that's a book by Lindsay Travinsky and Matthew Costello, are the editors. University of Virginia Press, 2023. And he is now writing the final chapter of a book that has been far too long in the making, his words, not mine. The presidency of Ronald Reagan, which will be due out with University of Kansas Press. Okay, so that is enough from me. Luke, if you'll get us started.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Anthony. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming to my presentation about the United States and the INF negotiations. In June 1985, the chief U.S. negotiator in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force talks, Paul Nitze, he spoke at Harvard University, and he shed light on the stalled INF negotiations, which covered American and Soviet ground-based missiles with maximum ranges of 1,000 to 5,500 kilometers. The INF negotiations, they went nowhere from 1981 to 1983, when the Soviet delegation bolted from Geneva, Switzerland, to protest the arrival of U.S. missiles in Europe. Therefore, Nitze shared an anecdote from British Ambassador William Hayter, whom he had met 30 years earlier. Negotiating with the Soviets, quote, was somewhat like dealing with a defective vending machine, Nitze joked. You put a coin in, nothing comes out. There might be sense in shaking the machine. You might get your coin back, but there is no use in talking to it. From the U.S. perspective, the INF negotiations were created to deal with the dire threat posed to Western security by the rapid buildup of Soviet SS-20 ground-based intermediate-range ballistic missiles. In August 1976, the Kremlin deployed the first of 441 road-mobile SS-20s on both sides of the Ural Mountains. With 3 warheads that could travel 5,000 kilometers, the SS-20 engendered fear throughout Europe. American officials predicted that 100 SS-20s could wreck every significant outpost in Europe. And at the time, the United States and its North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies, they lacked missiles, aside from 18 French land-based S-3s that were comparable to the SS-20. From 1981 to 1983, the Reagan administration's approach to the INF negotiations was more effective than existing scholarship suggests. President Ronald Reagan and his aides, including Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and Assistant Secretary of Defense Richard Pearl, they were serious about the zero option. In November 1981, Reagan proposed the zero option. At the time, it required the dismantlement of 600 operational Soviet missiles carrying 1,100 warheads in exchange for canceling the impending deployment of 108 U.S. Pershing IIs and 464 ground-launched cruise missiles to Europe. The White House, the State Department, and the Department of Defense agreed. It was a long shot. To enhance U.S. bargaining leverage, American policymakers planned to station missiles in Europe, and they achieved their secondary objective in fall 1983. The Reagan administration, it was also more flexible during the INF negotiations than previous scholarship has acknowledged. The zero option was not a take-it-or-leave-it proposition. U.S. officials recognized Allied and Democrat impatience with the INF deadlock, and they adapted negotiating tactics in winter 1982-1983, when they clarified in public what Reagan had already concluded in private. The zero option was not a Hobson's choice. There were limits to Reagan's flexibility as well. Like the Soviet leadership, he never authorized a proposal that had a realistic chance of being accepted during this period. However, the Reagan administration acquired bargaining chips, a growing arsenal of Pershing IIs and cruise missiles that allowed U.S. officials to negotiate from a stronger position. The Euromissile deployments, Secretary of State George Shultz recalled, were, quote, the turning point in the Cold War. In the shadow of anti-nuclear movements on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, the Reagan administration inherited a NATO initiative, the dual-track decision of December 1979, that was designed to arrest the SS-20 buildup. The Carter administration had persuaded the United Kingdom, the Federal Republic of Germany, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands to deploy the Euro missiles, 572 U.S.-owned and operated Pershing IIs and ground-launched cruise missiles. With Allied support, President Jimmy Carter and his aides planned to pursue INF negotiations with the Kremlin as well. They envisioned a global ceiling of 300 to 450 warheads on INF. For the dual-track decision to be successful, NATO needed to deploy several hundred U.S. missiles to Europe. Reagan, who established U.S. arms control policy and improvised in Geneva, he was committed to key principles throughout the INF negotiations. First, he aimed to advance his dream of abolishing nuclear weapons by proposing to reduce nuclear stockpiles. Quote, "He was not schooled in the particulars of arms control," Ambassador Kenneth Edelman remembered, but he wanted real reductions rather than limitations on future programs. Second, Reagan distrusted the Kremlin, which he was suspected would violate future arms agreements. Therefore, Reagan wanted a stringent INF verification regime, including on-site inspections. Otherwise, the Soviets could break out of an agreement that imposed a regional instead of a global ceiling on SS-20s by moving them back and forth across the Ural Mountains. Third, Reagan understood bargaining leverage. Quote, "He had developed negotiating skills and the knowledge of how you win negotiations," Governor Reagan's former chief of staff, Edwin Meese, later recalled, as president of the Screen Actors Guild. After deploying the Euro missiles, Reagan expected to negotiate from a stronger position. To create new weapons to trade for SS-20s, Secretary of State Alexander Haig, Schultz, Weinberger, and their respective staffs, they too prioritized the deployment of U.S. missiles to Europe. Otherwise, the United States would have little to trade for Soviet ground-based intermediate-range missiles. American strategic nuclear forces, which traveled over 5,500 kilometers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and long-range bombers, those weapons were tied up in START. The Soviets sought limitations on British and French nuclear stockpiles and U.S. dual-capable intermediate-range aircraft. But including those systems in the negotiations would have generated significant problems. From 1969 to 1987, British and French officials rejected limitations and reductions of their independent nuclear stockpiles. In addition, American dual-capable aircraft were often assigned conventional missions in Europe, where the Warsaw Pact maintained more soldiers and armor than NATO. Also, the Soviets never offered to fold their hundreds of dual-capable aircraft into the INF negotiations. In November, after November 1981, U.S. policymakers disagreed over how to respond to the Soviet rejection of the zero option. On one hand, the State Department was amenable to horse trading. Its fallback position was an offer to reduce INF to the lowest possible level. On the other hand, Weinberger and Pearl argued that the zero option was a take-it-or-leave-it offer. Quote, "I'm not opposed to arms control outright," Pearl later clarified. "If we're in a negotiating situation, we should make proposals that are in our interest and stick by them." Ronald Reagan was a real hero in this regard. Reagan never strayed from the ultimate goal of abolishing INF. But he demonstrated flexibility during the negotiations from 1981 to 1983. Ignoring Weinberger and Pearl's advice, he continued the INF talks after the imposition of martial law in Poland in 1981-1982 winter, and after the destruction of Korean Airlines Flight 007 in September 1983. Aware of European and Democrat impatience with the zero option, he offered to eliminate INF in phases under an interim accord in February 1983. It was another policy opposed by Weinberger and by Pearl. And more open-minded than that, Reagan proposed a global ceiling of 420 on superpower INF in November 1983. It did not require Soviet agreement to reach the zero option. However, Reagan tended to stick to his guns during the INF negotiations. An anti-communist, Reagan distrusted the Kremlin. He demanded a global INF deal with unprecedented verification provisions, including on-site inspections. The nuclear abolitionist, Reagan was frustrated by the INF deadlock. He hoped that Moscow would accept the zero option or suggest an interim deal that reduced SS-20s. The zero option, Secretary Shultz remembered, was, quote, Reagan's way of getting the Soviet intermediate-range missiles out of Europe. Given the theater nuclear imbalance, Reagan doubted that the Kremlin would offer meaningful concessions before November 1983. Therefore, he was patient with the INF impasse. After deploying U.S. missiles to Europe, Reagan was confident that a better accord could be secured. Quote, they'd left the ballpark, but I didn't think that the game was over, Reagan later wrote. It would only be a matter of time before the Soviets were back at the table. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions after my colleagues' presentations.
Luke, you were admirable staying within time.
Thank you.
But just for the future, Thomas, I will signal you, and then you will signal the speaker if they're going.
Is that because I'm coming up that you?
That's exactly right. So just he'll be the one that you can draw off of. I don't want you to have to look back at me.
So I don't offer you visuals today, and if my students were to ever find out, that would be the end of my academic career, because I demand that they only use visuals. I want to, first of all, just briefly thank Luke, Chester, and not Andrew, Anthony, for including me as not only part of this panel, but for allowing and indulging this opportunity to just read excerpts from my forthcoming book. Apocalypse Television, How the Day After Helped End the Cold War, is a popular nonfiction book designed for general audiences. So I want to put the emphasis on popular. Let's hope it is. And these are two brief excerpts. The book will be coming out later this fall, timed with the 40th anniversary of the TV movie The Day After. And I'll start with an excerpt prior to the broadcast of the movie, and then after and in the quarters of the White House. So Chapter 2. In June of 1982, over 1 million people, thongs as the New York Times called them, marched in Central Park. They joined chorus in support of nuclear disarmament in one of the largest protest gatherings in American history. As one protester declared, it's not just hippies and crazies anymore, it's everybody. One person marching in these protests was screenwriter Ed Hume, who recalled, I'd be out in the streets walking and figured, this is my opportunity to have a say. This is my way of doing it. Hume would even attend meetings hosted by friends, but was really put off by them. These protest movements were, in his estimation, acts of futility, although the cocktails were good. He wasn't, in his words, a committed activist, although philosophically I absolutely agreed with them. Hume couldn't be faulted for his populist fatalism in light of his father's tragic death. At the height of World War II, all Swedish civilian flights were clearly marked in bright orange to signal that the plane was a non-combatant. Nonetheless, a German fighter plane chose to pursue one such flight in 1943 for at least 10 minutes before firing 3 cannon and machine gun blasts. The radio operator barely had time to transmit, "We have been shot down," before the flight plummeted to the island of Hallo off the coast of Sweden. 2 survivors were thrown from the wreck into the North Sea and survived. The other 13 perished. One of these passengers, the only American, was Dr. T.C. Hume, a clergyman in his 30s on a mission to meet with the World Council of Churches in Europe about post-war reconstruction. T.C.'s father, a prominent medical missionary to China, had instilled in his son a clarity of purpose and a commitment to breaking down the divisions between people. T.C. could not have known that the end of World War II would cleave the world in half for decades. Back in the U.S., 5-year-old Ed Hume was left standing in the shadow of his larger-than-life father and grandfather. He ultimately rejected the medical and religious careers pursued by his family. After 1 year, he dropped out of Yale, a tradition that ran back for generations. In his brief time at the university, he crossed paths with future ABC network wunderkind Brandon Stoddard, whom he described as a small, twinkly guy who was utterly charming. He gravitated to the small liberal arts college of Oberlin, famously known for its dedication to social justice. From Oberlin, he pursued a career in journalism where his interest in politics, art, history, and film converged in a job as an entertainment reporter at Look magazine. Watching films led him to moonlight as a screenwriter, initially on small-budget films that ran the gamut from crime dramas to a modern-day version of Anna Karenina. Soon, Hume's political passions landed him to TV, where he might tackle more mature topics. But Hume found his greatest success writing the pilots for some of the most successful, if arguably banal, crime series on television, including Cannon and The Streets of San Francisco. Hume led, as he described it, a double-track life, able to make a living on TV while I was working on things that I found more interesting. Hume credits his agent Lee Rosenberg with getting him a meeting at ABC. Rosenberg had also helped ABC executive Stu Samuels transition from a career at TV Guide to his position in under Brandon Stoddard in the TV movie department. After confirming Hume's interest in nuclear war, Rosenberg said, "I'm setting you up with a meeting with Brandon Stoddard." As Hume recounted in the television event documentary, "I'd had a long sympathy with the disarmament movement, which I don't think ABC was aware of, but I saw it as a fortunate coincidence of the right person at the right time." Still, Hume remained skeptical of his contribution to the cause, much as he had been convinced that the protests made little difference. Even there in the room with powerful network executives presented with the opportunity to leave his mark, Hume suspected the film might never get made, and he had good cause, including a shelf lined with politically themed screenplays that, for whatever reason, had gone unproduced. The whole time he was writing, "I thought something's going to prevent it from being made." Project X had lived on an internal development report for over a year with no progress towards finding a screenwriter. Eventually, the junior executive in the department, Steve White, prepared a list of writers that included the usual suspects. As White confirmed, "We all knew who they were." There was a short list of writers who were at the top of the game. Writers like William Blinn and J.P. Miller, who had started out as playwrights, made their way into television through the anthology series of the 1950s and graduated to Emmy-nominated work in TV movies. Hume was younger. He'd written the pilots of successful detective series and a few highly rated and critically acclaimed projects like 21 Hours at Munich about the 1972 Olympic hostage crisis. In White's words, "The only problem with Eddie is he was so handsome. It was hard to pay attention to what he was saying. He was far too good-looking to be a writer." Aside from his original concept of a post-nuclear account, ABC's Brandon Stoddard had only 2 broad notes. The story must be, quote, "authentic, show what nuclear war would be like," and apolitical, avoid the decision makers, focus on average citizens in the heartland. In the meeting with the 2 executives, Hume said that he wanted to avoid overtly political themes and large-scale depictions of the world at war. "If it was going to be the U.S. versus the USSR, I didn't want to do it." Hume explained how the villains are the weapons themselves, and Americans are going to be victims just like everyone else in the world. The Midwest setting was also Hume's idea, according to him, the homeland that epitomized American innocence. Hume's vision for the movie was in full alignment with the interests of ABC, and he left the room almost in shock. I couldn't believe that I had gone into the meeting and they agreed with everything I said. He had the job. His mission, blow up the heartland over 2 nights in prime time. Throughout development, production, and broadcast, and for decades to follow, Stoddard would repeatedly claim the project's aims were non-political. All the storytellers, including Hume, were given explicit direction. They would never take sides in the Cold War, never assign blame for the cause of the attack. The program should limit any depiction of warfare, generals, or the Pentagon, although there would be a critical subplot involving Air Force officers working in the missile silos. By avoiding these pitfalls, the goal was to secure the broadest possible audience and in turn maximize profitability. These prohibitions extended to interviews given at the time by members of the production as well as the publicity and marketing team at ABC, but it could not be enforced upon the rogue publicists, activists, and political actors who would eventually hijack the film for their partisan purpose. Nonetheless, while the pitch proved auspicious, writing the screenplay would take Hume into the heart of nuclear darkness. For nearly 2 years of research, he consulted numerous texts, including the government pamphlet, The Effects of Nuclear War, Jonathan Schell's essay collection, The Fate of the World, and books and short films produced by the Physicians for Social Responsibility. Hume delved deeper into scientific texts, interviewed experts at MIT. I didn't want to get anything wrong. For Hume, writing the day after was the most supercharged in my whole career. When it came time, I must have written it in less than 2 months. At the end of 1980, he delivered a 200-plus page script and held his breath. You start biting your nails waiting to hear back. Stoddard found Hume's script so breathtaking that he reportedly cried. According to Stu Samuels, the first draft confirmed that we can shoot this thing. Samuels' one criticism was the title, Silence in Heaven. The phrase was borrowed from the book of Revelations in the New Testament. It described the events of Judgment Day, during which heaven remained silent for about half an hour, noting that 30 minutes was roughly the amount of time between the launch of a nuclear missile and its deadly arrival a continent away. Hume thought the title was irresistible, and it had another meaning, that we're not getting any help from up there. We've got to sort it out ourselves. For Samuels, the title was a non-starter. Although poetic, it ain't going to happen. After discussing the script in Stoddard's office, Samuels experienced an epiphany. Since the story was about the aftermath of nuclear war, I suddenly thought of the words, the day after. Returning to his boss's office, Samuel proposed the title, and Brandon lit up. Everybody just loved it. Everyone except for Hume, who was hurt. I wasn't even told about it. It simply appeared on a later draft. The day after, I don't even know what that means. Nevertheless, I just shut my mouth. In the spring of 1981, the phone rang at Hume's home in New England. Brandon Stoddard's twinkly, charismatic voice was on the other end. "How are you?" Brandon inquired. Hume responded, "Fine, kind of down." Stoddard confided they were definitely making the movie, which for most screenwriters, producers, directors, anyone involved in the early and precarious stages of development for a project was typically cause for celebration. Yet Hume sounded despondent. When Stoddard asked why, Hume replied, "Do you know what it's like to get up every day for the last 2 years and deal with the destruction of the world?" Chapter 11, Rapprochement. The New York Times had misreported that Reagan previewed the day after a week before it aired, when in fact it had been a month prior. That article also claimed he had seen it again when it was broadcast for reasons left only to speculation, although it was unlikely Reagan was watching the Kennedy miniseries on the other network. 2 days after the film aired, the president credited the administration's response to the film as well handled, while dismissing the film's message. It didn't say anything we didn't already know, that nuclear war would be horrible, which is why we're doing what we're doing, so there won't be one. These protestations appeared less that of a national leader versed in international policy than a vague platitude evocative of the B-list films he'd appeared in earlier in life. In reality, for over a month, what the administration was actually doing had changed significantly. Gergen's campaign had explicitly pivoted away from evil empires, winnable wars, escalating arms races, or SDI. Reagan was to be presented as a peacekeeper who achieved his goals through a policy of deterrence rather than defense buildup or nuclear gamesmanship. Gergen's PR shock troops had been given explicit instructions not to challenge the premise of the film, but to harness its message to promote a starkly different vision and tone for the arms race. Although Gergen took the fall for the campaign, It is hard to imagine he presented this more nuanced, less aggressive, more pacifist position without at least the tacit blessing of the man in the Oval Office, even if this message stood in stark defiance of the hardliners down the hall. National Security Agency documents that were declassified in 2010 provide further insight into Reagan's thinking around this time. NSA briefing books drafted in the wake of Operation Able Archer reveal that CIA Director Casey repeatedly warned the president of a stunning array of indicators that the Soviets were exhibiting signs of genuine fear in response to NATO exercises. Likewise, NSA advisor Robert McFarlane approached the president on multiple occasions to escalate his concerns about Soviet nuclear paranoia. As he recollected, the situation was very grave. It was serious. The Soviets were no longer huffing and puffing, crying wolf, rattling their pots and pans in a strategic performance to deter U.S. military action. Intelligence agencies had flagged numerous tells from the Soviets, indicating that Reagan's nuclear saber-rattling was more than bluster and were instead the rhetoric of a madman determined to wipe out the communist boogeyman. Years later, a newly declassified CIA Studies and Intelligence article would admit that Soviet fears of a preemptive U.S. nuclear strike, while exaggerated, were scarcely insane. In response to these warnings, Reagan repeatedly expressed genuine anxiety. It did bother him that the Soviets could even take seriously the very idea of a U.S. strike. It is fascinating that a president who spent his first career in Hollywood had not previously grasped that the Soviets were taking his performance seriously. On November 18th, 2 days before the broadcast, Reagan attended a meeting with Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and General Vasey of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for a briefing about the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. Since 1961, military leadership had been instructed to routinely update the president on America's plans in the event of a nuclear war. These plans now targeted not only military installations, but also the Kremlin. Based on some accounts, for 2 years, Reagan had skipped the meetings, the first time any president had taken a pass on discussing the greatest existential threat to the nation, but not this year. As he witnessed his military experts describe the war games they had planned in the event of an attack, the president appeared even more engaged than you would expect, considering he had skipped prior meetings. According to Weinberger, the presentation brought home to anybody the fantastically horrible events that would surround such a scenario, most notable to the commander-in-chief. Reagan's state of mind in the briefing had been influenced by watching the day after. In his diary, Reagan described the SIOP meeting as the most sobering experience. In several ways, the sequence of events paralleled those in the ABC movie. Simply put, it was a scenario for a sequence of events that could lead to the end of civilization as we know it. Reagan also mentioned the broadcast of the film and the campaign to hijack its narrative with the help of his Secretary of State. George is going on ABC right after its big nuclear bomb film Sunday night. We know it's anti-nuke propaganda, but we're going to take it over and say it shows why we must keep on doing what we're doing. However, what he wrote next directly contradicted the idea of doing what we're doing, as well as his often expressed Manichaean views of an American good confronted by Soviet evil. He described having discussed plans with Secretary Shultz for setting up a little in-house group of experts on the Soviet Union to set up some channels. I feel the Soviets are so defense-minded, so paranoid about being attacked that without being in any way soft on them, we ought to let them know that no one here has any intention of doing anything like that. Still, this strategy remained trapped within his own contempt for the Soviet way of life. What the hell have they got that anyone would want? Notwithstanding Reagan's more nuanced perspective, the Pershing missiles were delivered to Europe as scheduled in response to overwhelming protests by anti-nuclear activists. The military had to go stealth, sneaking missiles past the gates late at night. In Italy, the mafia helped contain demonstrations while the Air Force delivered their packages. Tensions ratcheted higher as the Soviets deployed more of their missiles, then suspended the long, lingering negotiations over intermediate-range nuclear arms. 4 minutes. Reagan's administration were still advancing the world to the brink, and Reagan knew and feared it. In an interview with People magazine, he turned his mind to God. There were times in the past when we thought the end of the world was coming, but never anything like this. Still, Reagan was not yet willing to fully abandon his hardliner position, especially when the CIA delivered a fully contradictory account that his policies were working well. They warned against taking a more conciliatory posture towards the USSR. This makes all the more remarkable the speech that Reagan delivered on the 16th of January, an address that historian James Mann has called strikingly conciliatory. Rather than his usual speech writers, Reagan asked his Soviet experts to take the first pass, but he would pen the last section himself. Admittedly, his contribution read something like a children's book, imagining characters named Ivan, Anya, Jim, and Sally speaking without any language barrier about children, ambitions, and hobbies, making ends meet, and perhaps even having plans to have dinner together. And perhaps the greatest non sequitur ever delivered, Reagan proclaimed prosaically, above all, they would have proven that people don't make wars. Although the speech was finished after Christmas, he held off on delivering it until mid-January on the advice of the First Lady's astrologer. Political scientist Beth Fisher has called the speech evidence of Reagan's reversal, the turning point in his administration's approach to the Kremlin, marked by new policy goals and strategies. Abandoning any talk of evil empires, Reagan now spoke of common interests with the Soviets and the need to join together to solve global problems. As Fisher points out, the rhetoric was diametrically different from the anti-Soviet speech given by his Deputy Secretary of State Kenneth Dam just 10 weeks prior. 6 months later, Reagan reiterated these policy goals in a speech at the UN. The proverbial warmonger was now citing Gandhi, claiming no dispute in the world was too great to overcome. Human nature is the same. If you approached people with trust and affection, you would have tenfold trust and thousandfold affection returned to you. We're all God's children with much in common. Nonetheless, the gatekeepers of the Reagan myth, even many of his biographers, have either discounted or ignored these shifts in policy and rhetoric. At the time, many claimed the president was putting on yet another performance solely for political gain. According to Washington Post columnist Mary McGrory, the president had been dragged kicking and screaming into the East Room to deliver that speech. Nonetheless, in the lead-up to his re-election campaign, the pacifist-leaning speech reflected the savvy politician's attempt to outflank Democrats who had alluded to him as warmonger-in-chief. It was not just Reagan's rhetoric that shifted. At the time, there was also an array of policy pivots. Despite the claims by Reagan's friend Lawrence Bailenson that diplomacy was for fools, Reagan pressed for greater dialogue and pushed for in-person summits. His administration made new attempts to secure arms reduction measures and cultivate confidence building to assuage Soviet fears of an American attack. Meetings were scheduled in June with the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. Without the prerequisites, Reagan would offer strategic trade-offs to get the Soviets to the table. Members of his cabinet were asked to meet with their counterparts in the Kremlin. A fax machine was installed, a new incarnation of the infamous Moscow-Washington hotline. Since the events, no one would or should claim that the day after singularly changed the president's mind. Historian Adrian Hane has argued that the nuclear freeze movement played a powerful role in persuading Reagan of the need to pivot, although even Hane concedes the film presumably had a profound effect. According to journalist Will Bunch, the story of the film's impact is fascinating and humanizing and understandably isn't part of the Reagan myth so vigorously pushed by a new breed of conservative activists and politicians in the decades that followed. And yet the notion that Reagan single-handedly engineered the collapse of the Soviet Union would appear to be as absurd as the idea that his entire belief system had been altered by watching a TV movie. The mythos of Reagan as superhero defeating the evil empire wasn't even credible at the time the Berlin Wall fell, according to polls. Most Americans credited the dropping of the Iron Curtain to Mikhail Gorbachev. Nevertheless, historians and biographers have made clear that stories in cinema had a significant influence on the president's imagination and in turn, his beliefs and policies. Staff and advisors recounted how the president started every meeting with a story or required one to grab his attention. No one knew more stories than him, said Reagan's Treasury Secretary. Beth Fisher has described Reagan as an anecdotal thinker. He expresses his views through stories, most of them revolving around human beings. According to political scientist Richard Pius, Reagan could only understand things if they were presented in a story. Had he chosen another career besides acting and leader of the free world, Reagan might have made a great filmmaker or TV executive, perhaps to rival ABC's Stoddard. Film occupied Reagan's attention like no other medium. According to biographer Luke Cannon, Reagan spent more time watching movies than anything else. When his chief of staff, James Baker, asked why Reagan had not prepared for an important summit, well, Jim, The Sound of Music was on last night. In television event, former director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, Ken Edelman, said that the Reagans liked big, fat, red-blooded American stories like Top Gun, where the military was glamorized, and the good guys triumph, although a certain TV movie arguably proved too real. White House records would indicate that the president screened over 350 movies over 8 years. These films served as more than mere entertainment or mild diversion from his day job. Rather, as Luke Cannon claimed, he drew his reality from the movies. Reagan was receptive to the sensory impressions of films, and he was apt to retain what he saw and heard on screen. Few things in the world are ever beyond question, and certainly not the heart and mind of another person, and least of all the 40th American president. Journalist and James Mann had described how Reagan had shrewd instincts, but rarely, if ever, articulated his underlying motivations, not in public or private, not even in his diaries and memoirs. At times, as Bunch described, he was willing to allow others to assume he was a man of simple principles, utterly without cunning. With his cabinet, he often appeared guileless and easily swayed, until he didn't. Until he would override his handlers, chart new policies, and fire his detractors. He could deliver fire and brimstone speeches about evil empires while simultaneously delivering postcards to his Soviet pen pals. He would publicly frame his opponents as cinematic nemeses, but face-to-face confide in them his deepest fears. Regarding the different accounts of the real Reagan and the extent to which the day after helped shape his approach to foreign policy, this author cannot possibly adjudicate. You cannot merely dismiss the views of the gatekeepers, those who still to this day defend and protect his legacy, who celebrate the economic and cultural revolution he led, as well as the judgments of his detractors, those appalled by his leading man bravado, by his policies that thrust the poor, people of color, and laborers into the street, nor those in the queer community who bore witness to the decimation of an entire generation of men in the face of an epidemic that the man in the White House refused to acknowledge, much less dedicate resources to prevent, combat, and cure. Perhaps Reagan's brain was hardwired to react to a fictional account of an American nuclear holocaust. Perhaps it was the downed passenger airline, terrorist car bombs, or nuclear false alarms. Perhaps it was that meeting with generals about the aftermath of nuclear war. Whatever the reasons, Reagan began to play a new game of chess after the fall of 1983.
Okay, thanks. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Thanks to the conference organizers and sponsors and my fellow panelists. You've already heard a little bit about the speech I'm going to talk about. I hope I'll tell you a little bit more. Ronald Reagan knew how to tell a good story, and he told one of his best in his address on U.S.-Soviet relations on January 16, 1984. Speech quickly became known as the Jim and Sally, Ivan and Anya address because of the fictional characters, 2 Americans, 2 Soviets, the president created to explain that people in both the United States and the Soviet Union wanted to live in a world without fear and without war. Reagan used these 4 imaginary individuals to ease the widespread nuclear fear that had unsettled Americans and, of course, people around the world during the past year or even more. He also, though, hoped that his speech would reassure conservatives that he remained committed to negotiating from strength and that he thought the Soviets were mainly responsible for the recent increase in Cold War tensions. Reagan, in short, wanted to build support for improved relations with Moscow by using his political skill to reassure very different constituencies at home and abroad at the beginning of a presidential election year. His speech also showed how fiction as well as fact shaped the popular and official thinking about the Cold War. While 1984 seemed ominous before it even began, George Orwell assured that through his dystopian novel published 35 years earlier. In 1984, Orwell imagined a world of war and revolution with 3 great powers, including one ruled by Big Brother that suppressed dissident thought and eradicated truth. In the fictional 1984, the Ministry of Peace waged perpetual war. The Ministry of Truth disseminated propaganda. A real propagandist, someone named Victor Sopi, inverted the usual interpretation of Orwell's novel as a scathing indictment of Russian communism. And in an article in early 1984 for the Soviet journal New Times, Sapi contended instead that Orwell was attacking bourgeois democracy and Reagan was Orwell's big brother. Well, Ronald Reagan had played many roles before, but not Big Brother. And he looked forward to 1984, not with foreboding, but with optimism. The American economy was booming, he wrote in his presidential memoir. We'd come a long way since the 70s when our country was plagued by self-doubt and uncertainty. The president also believed that his defense buildup had put the country in the strongest position in 2 decades to negotiate with the Russians from strength. In strength and military spirit, America was back, Reagan said. But what tempered his upbeat outlook was his belief that Soviet leaders feared a U.S. attack. 3 years in the White House, he wrote, it taught me something surprising about the Russians. I began to realize that many Soviet officials feared us not only as adversaries, but as potential aggressors who might hurl nuclear weapons at them in a first strike. The president had previously dismissed those Soviet allegations as nothing more than propaganda, but in the final weeks of 1983, he changed his mind and believed that the Soviet fears were genuine. I feel that the Soviets are so defense-minded, so paranoid about being attacked, he wrote in his diary in November, that without being in any way soft on them, we ought to tell them that no one here has any intention of doing anything like that. What, again, as David pointed out, what the hell have they got that anyone would want? Well, the widespread nuclear fear during 1983 may have given Reagan some empathy for his adversaries in the Kremlin. Same day that he wrote in his diary about Soviet leaders fearing an attack, he got, as David has pointed out, his briefing about the PSYOP, Plan for All-Out Nuclear War, attacks on 50,000 Soviet targets. It had a deep impression on him, and what made the unimaginable, this PSYOP, more comprehensible was the television movie The Day After. Not the only thing that did, but certainly it helped. 2 days after it aired only 2 days after the PSYOP briefing. Reagan had seen it previously. He wrote that the sequence of events described in the briefing paralleled those in the ABC movie. So for Reagan, fiction and fact combined to make urgent new steps to hasten the nuclear danger. The president authorized George Shultz to establish a Saturday morning breakfast group to study how to get a clearer message to the Soviets about U.S. intentions. Even before the Saturday group, though, began its work, Reagan decided that he should make a major speech to reassure Soviet leaders of his peaceful intention and to dispel the popular caricature of him as a warmonger. While aides drafted that speech, Reagan used an interview with Time magazine to calm public fears about nuclear war and to appeal to the Soviets to resume arms control negotiations that they had left in late 1983. The interview appeared in the year-end issue of Time magazine, where they chose Reagan and Soviet leader Yuri Andropov as Men of the Year. Reagan mixed kind of confident assertions about rejuvenated U.S. power with conciliatory messages to the Kremlin. Both superpowers knew that a nuclear war would destroy the world. Reagan said, why don't we reduce our arsenals? And if we start down that road on reducing, for heaven's sakes, why don't we rid the world of these weapons? Why do we keep them? Here's a world today whose principal armaments would wipe out civilians in the tens and hundreds of millions. Let's get back to being civilized. So while the president imagined ultimately a revolutionary breakthrough in negotiations, his aides doubted that there would be any significant improvement in Soviet-American relations in the year ahead. Andropov was in perilous health. The deployment of U.S. INF missiles in Europe had intensified fears that Reagan really wanted to destroy the evil empire. Soviets had walked out of both the INF and START talks only weeks earlier, and U.S. election year politics made the Kremlin suspicious of any new White House initiative. Yet despite that bleak forecast, the Saturday breakfast group agreed that it was essential to ease public anxieties, both in the United States and in Europe, that the Reagan administration fears that the Reagan administration wasn't interested in talking to the Soviets. Jack Matlock on the National Security Council cautioned that there would be no quick fix, but a presidential speech could alleviate public confusion about administration policy and signal U.S. interest in solving international problems. A draft speech was ready for Reagan before Christmas, but the White House postponed the address. According to Matlock, it was because of the intervention of the First Lady, relying on Joan Quigley, her astrologer, who thought the alignment of the stars and the planets in mid-December was inauspicious. In addition, Reagan complained about the speech. He said it offered nothing new and was written in pedestrian prose, and Matlock had drafted most of it. Matlock tried to turn dullness into a virtue. Good luck with that. The address was supposed to convey, he said, calmness and steadiness in a time of international anxiety. Well, Reagan eventually agreed to deliver a speech that provided clarity about U.S. policy and hope for better relations rather than any new initiatives, but he wouldn't settle for a boring address. After the New Year's holiday, he spent an afternoon at Camp David reworking the speech, so it reassured both friends and critics that he didn't plan to blow up the world. Those were his words. He also gave what had been a prosaic speech a conclusion that only he could have imagined. So it became his first major address of 1984. He delivered it at 10 a.m., the early time in Washington, chosen to ensure maximum afternoon and evening coverage in Europe and in the Soviet Union as an exercise in public diplomacy. His main point was that a recovering economy, fortified defenses, renewed commitment to fundamental values hadn't just halted the U.S. decline, but also created the best opportunity in years to forge a constructive relationship with the Kremlin. He said U.S. deterrence had made the world safer, but not safe enough. He's pointed out the Soviets still use threats, subversion, and invasion to extend their influence in the Middle East, Central America, Afghanistan, and Africa. They distorted or defied treaties and other agreements, as a report that the White House sent to Congress only days later documented. But the president didn't dwell on those criticisms. He made them many times before. In his speech, Reagan hoped for advances in three main areas: reducing the use of force in international disputes, diminishing stockpiles of armaments, improving cooperation between Washington and Moscow. He recognized that immediate objectives should be modest, but he still imagined transformative agreements. In this speech, he said, "I support a zero option for all nuclear arms. It's not an impossible dream." Then came the memorable conclusion that he had penned, based on the imaginary characters. What if a Soviet couple, Ivan and Anya, could spend some time with Americans, Jim and Sally, and they could talk to each other without language difficulties? Would they debate the differences between their respective governments, Reagan asked, or would they find themselves comparing notes about their children and what each did for a living? Reagan believed that these two newly acquainted couples would chat about ambitions and hobbies and problems of making ends meet. Matlock revised the original version that Reagan wrote of this made-up conversation so that it seemed more like a vignette from the 1980s than the 1950s. Reagan had the two women sharing recipes. Matlock had them chatting about Sally's work as a music teacher. So Reagan's thinking about women's roles may have been stuck in a bygone era, but he knew how to make his larger point. People want to raise their children in a world without fear and without war. They want to have some of the good things that make life worth living. They want to work at some craft, trade, or profession that gives them satisfaction and sense of worth. Their common interests cross all borders. Now, if that final section seemed familiar, it was because Reagan had written almost the same thing to Andropov's predecessor, Leonid Brezhnev. It was in the letter that he drafted in longhand while he was recovering from the assassination attempt, and there you see it. The language in some ways is almost identical. The peoples of the world have very much in common. They want the dignity of having some control of their individual destiny. And Reagan said, should we not be concerned with eliminating the obstacles that prevent our people, should we not be concerned with eliminating the obstacles which prevent our people, the people we represent, from achieving their most cherished goals? People found out about that language in a private letter when Reagan used it in November 1981, announcing his zero-option proposal at the National Press Club. So 3 years later, Reagan was ready to provide Jim and Sally, Yvonne and Anya, and some real people too, Americans and Soviets, what he believed were their most cherished goals. The main responsibility, though, and he had said this many times before, lay with the Soviet leaders. If the Soviet government wants peace, then there will be peace. Let us begin now. So his exercise in public diplomacy produced the expected international reaction. NATO allies praised it. Soviets condemned it. More in the paper about that. Point out just the reaction of Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador, who said that any other time such a speech by an American president would have been regarded as a tangible step toward improving relations with the Soviets. But less than a year after the Evil Empire speech and weeks after the deployment of the first U.S. Pershing II missiles, hard to believe in Reagan's sincerity. The speech, though, changed Reagan's public tone about Soviet-American relations, if not his substantive position. And again, David has pointed that out. Many critics and observers and commentators thought it was a political ploy, a way to advance his position in the election campaign. George Kennan, for example, said that Reagan was now running as a peace candidate because of the powerful reaction to the day after in the nuclear freeze movement. Reagan's pollster, Richard Worthlin, provided Reagan data about his weaknesses as he approached the re-election campaign. And the biggest weakness was public fears about Reagan's potential foreign policy. During the years of 1982 and 1983, a majority of people were critical of Reagan's foreign policy, and their biggest fear was that Reagan would start another war. So certainly politics and the election year campaign had an awful lot to do with the tone of the speech. In addition, Democratic candidates like Walter Mondale began criticizing Reagan's foreign policy more and more as the economy improved. They shifted attention away from criticizing economic policies and more about foreign policies. Mondale blamed Reagan for a dangerous escalation of the arms race. It's 3 minutes to midnight, and we are scarcely talking to the Soviets at all. Reagan's conciliatory rhetoric, and this is the main point I want to make, aimed at neutralizing this political criticism and reassuring voters. He talked to moderates, wanted to ease their fears that, in fact, he was in favor of talking to the Soviets, but he also wanted to reassure conservatives, too, that he believed strongly still in negotiating from strength. And in short, he cast himself in an unconventional and demanding role of a tough anti-communist who was genuinely interested in peace. So let me wrap this up with something about its aftermath. There were no breakthroughs in Soviet-American relations in the wake of Reagan's speech, even if his new emphasis altered his public tone. Andropov died 3 weeks after the speech. His sickly successor, Konstantin Chernenko, spurned Reagan's overture for a summit, fearful that any improvement in Soviet-American relations would only benefit Reagan's re-election campaign. But after realizing that Reagan would surely win a second term, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko visited the White House in late September, the first time since the war in Afghanistan began, and the two, after sparring back and forth, agreed that the problem of problems was their enormous nuclear arsenal and what to do about it. They made no progress, but maybe a first step forward occurred after the meeting when, at Gromyko's suggestion, Mrs. Reagan promised to whisper peace in the president's ear every night, and then she also whispered the magic word in the blushing foreign minister's ear at that moment. Now, rarely, if ever, can a single speech reset a complex and difficult international relationship, especially one as fraught as Soviet-American relations in 1984. But speeches can change the tone and inspire hope. Reagan referred to a previous address of that sort in his speech. He alluded to John F. Kennedy's speech at American University in June of 1963, where President Kennedy said, in the final analysis, speaking about Soviets and Americans, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. and we are all mortal. So like Kennedy 2 decades earlier, Reagan was looking for a way to move beyond the rigidities of the Cold War. What Kennedy explained in soaring rhetoric, Reagan captured in a folksy story with fictional characters. Jim and Sally, Yvonne and Anya suggested that shared humanity could help ease Cold War tensions and lessen nuclear dangers. So in his idiosyncratic and charming way, Reagan imagined a future more hopeful and peaceful than the real or fictional world of 1984. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have just a few comments. I do not do as good of a Kennedy impression as Chester, and certainly not as good of a Reagan impression, so I'll keep it in my normal voice. The panelists made it pretty easy for me. This is clearly a very coherent panel, but I do want to take a few moments to reflect on some key themes. Cold War fact and fiction gives us a sense of the realities of the Cold War preoccupied the official mind and the public imagination. But they offer two sides of these nuclear Cold War realities, both the presentation of policies and the making of policies themselves within the administration, and at times it appears insulated from public opinion. I'll start with Luke. He tracks the implementation of the dual-track strategy in U.S. policy, a strategy that traces its origin to the Hormel Doctrine and NATO's nuclear readjustment after the French exit from integrated command in the 1960s. And he keeps the story tightly in the administration's debates about the zero option, and ultimately concludes that Reagan was in fact his own man when it came to the intersection of strategic thinking and nuclear abolition. And he reasserts what Beth Fisher told us last night, that the acquisition of leverage was always the first step of Reagan's peace through strength strategy. How we went about getting that leverage and determining what that leverage would be is another question that could get a little more interrogation. First, who's the one pushing Reagan to be flexible on the zero option? Or is it something that he's making that determination himself? Does it come from within the administration or from outside the administration, especially from European partners? Here, I might embarrass someone in the audience. Susie Colburn's book, Euro Missiles, would be very complimentary, of course, as is Leopoldo Nuti's edited volume on the Euro Missile crisis several years ago. Definitely presents complimentary reading to Luke's paper and his book. Second, how sincere were Reinberger and Pearl in their commitment to the zero option as a realistic path forward on arms control? Other research suggests that their engagement with the plan was more a subversive attempt to provoke the Soviets to walk out of arms control, or a play to soothe public opinion. Public opinion. Now we're on to David. David gives us a better sense of the moments that public opinion mobilized in opposition to Reagan's nuclear policies, starting with the scene of the June 1982 Central Park protest, the largest in American history to that point in time. We should also note that is the subject of a new book by Vincent Intondi, specifically on that protest. Might be worth thinking about in conjunction with your work. But what he does is he recovers the impetus for the creation of The Day After, the sensational TV event that captivated, 100 million viewers?
Depends on who you talk to.
Depends on who you talk to, okay. And the Reagans themselves. We're reminded that Reagan was a pop culture president, and a particular pop culture moment that allowed people to exercise more authority in national security debates than they had previously. He shows us nonetheless that when packaged differently, ideas produced and associated by the anti-nuclear movement did have a positive impact on Reagan's view of the need for nuclear abolition. David's paper put in conversation with the most recent scholarship, and here I'm thinking of Stephanie Freeman's great book, Dreams for a Decade, that just came out a few months ago, but also a classic, Paul Ledow's book on nuclear abolition, is a good reminder that abolitionism is no monolith. Okay? It took on multiple forms, and only when those ideas about nuclear abolition coalesced into a happy synthesis or an equilibrium were they turned into executable policy. David ends with the Ivan and Anya speech as a sign of reversal. But let me reframe that a bit differently. And I hope you react to this reframing, David. Let me know what you think. First, as we know from Chester's paper, from James Graham Wilson's book, from Simon's book, Reagan's pen pal strategy for engagement with the Soviet Union begins back in 1981 with outreach to Brezhnev and continued on through his presidency. Second, presentation and policy are two different things. 1984 is an election year. The arms race is considered Reagan's biggest liability, as Chester points out. And the Soviet walkout from arms control was a carefully stage-managed event in the U.S. Add to that, of course, the Cal 007 disaster. And Reagan's magnanimity, by contrast, draws attention to Soviet violations of international norms and a refusal to engage constructively in international diplomacy. Now on to Chester, because this is a good segue to Chester's paper, which brings us into the context of the Ivan and Anya speech. Chester presents a very compelling account about how Reagan constructed his own perception of the Cold War and how he was able to manifest that perception into a reality that brought about the end of the Cold War. And like Beth and Steve told us last night, Reagan resisted the recommendations of his speechwriters to create a rhetorical framework for engagement with the Soviets. He points to his ability to reconcile domestic politics and an international audience. More generally, Chester's work reminds us of the importance of elections in national security, an issue that has been surprisingly understudied despite the fact that scholars have long recognized that domestic politics shape foreign and defense policy. But Chester, I'm going to ask you a question that I get asked myself, and so this way I can steal your ideas. It's one that the likes of someone like George Edwards likes to ask. How do we know that Reagan's communicative prowess actually moved public opinion in a way that he wanted it to move? So I will leave it there. I think that's plenty for you all to respond to, and we have what I believe is about a half hour for good Q&A, so this group should have a good shot at each of our panelists. Why don't we go in order of the papers?
Sure. All right, so the first question is, who is pushing Ronald Reagan to be flexible on INF? There are three primary groups that Reagan is going to listen to. The first is the allies in Western Europe, in particular the NATO-basing countries of West Germany, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The stakes were quite high in those countries. They wanted to see progress on the negotiating track, or they could get voted out of office, and that's exactly what happened to the Schmidt government. So the allies, especially not in the United Kingdom, are pushing for progress. In Congress, you also see Democrats who grow impatient with the INF impasse. Someone like Ronald DeLooms, a congressperson from California, tried to cut the funding for the Pershing II. He suggested delaying the Pershing II deployments for 6 months, all in order to provide additional time to negotiate. And the State Department advocated U.S. flexibility throughout. Whether it was Secretary of State Alexander Haig, Schultz, or Burt, they all pushed Reagan to not stick with the take it or leave it zero option. On whether or not the zero option is a deadly gambit, I understand that it's not a popular opinion, but in my research and based on the interviews I did with U.S. policymakers and what I found at the archives, I think it's time to move past Strobe Talbot's book that was written during the negotiations in 1984, 1985, and maybe consider the fact that Weinberger and Pearl were serious about the zero option. I have Pearl on the record saying that the dual-track decision was going to deploy missiles to Europe that were, quote, expensive and useless, and therefore it was worthwhile to try and get rid of the lousy program through arms control. From Richard Pearl's perspective, the deployment of U.S. missiles to Europe was not going to enhance U.S. deterrence, and he did not think that the weapons needed to be there. The United States had hundreds of sea and air-launched weapons that could do that. And in addition to that, from Pearl's perspective, 100 or 50 SS-20s in Europe was too many. They could target every single part of NATO Europe that was valuable. And so for Pearl, it is U.S. missiles to offset the Soviets, SS-20s, or it's the zero option, where neither side has any one. For Pearl, it was 50 or 100 SS-20s was too many. And so I'm arguing in my book that Weinberger and Pearl are quite serious about the zero option. It's a proposal that was in the U.S. interest, and they advocated it consistently throughout the entire Reagan administration.
David, would you want to go next?
I think so. I'd say that it's unfair to list Reagan as the pop culture president if you wanted to go back to Jacksonian's use of pamphlet strategy 150 years earlier. I would
There could
argue.
be many pop culture presidents. He's just one of them.
Absolutely. FDR and his fireside chats would certainly apply, and God forbid we bring up the more recent pop culture president, and I'm sure we'll have Mr. Beast running for president soon. Not even a joke. About whether or not this was the reversal, to me, the debate over whether this is in forms of rhetoric and presentation versus policy becomes a little hard to ascertain, because even in terms of his personal descriptions of where his mind was, he was a bit inscrutable. His diaries don't necessarily give us or tell us where his soul or his mind was at, but there's little doubt that the language not only changed after this moment in a dramatic fashion, but we now have evidence of all of these covert administrative efforts that were happening behind the scenes to establish greater discourse. In other words, pushing towards more in-person summits and interactivity was a position that had, up until that point, had not worked effectively. So even whether or not the policy ramifications of these changes in presentation were immediate, were obviously predicated on a whole much more complex dynamic of what was going on, obviously, over in the Soviet Union as well.
Over to you, Justin.
Okay, public opinion, and to the extent that Reagan can influence, any president can influence it, that's a difficult question. It sort of reminds me every time that somebody tells me that Dow Jones is up or down because of some rational explanation, and of course, there are many, many decisions. But I think, Reagan remained vulnerable on the issue of war and peace. That issue didn't go away. Yet if you look at exit polls in 1984, he still had, the voters had more confidence in him handling foreign policy issues generally than Mondale. About the only question that Mondale was superior, at least in voter sentiment, was dealing with poverty or something like that. But international issues, Reagan did well. The other thing is, we all write or teach about the nuclear freeze movement in 1982 and 1983. Maybe with the exception of Lawrence Whitner, how much do we say about the nuclear freeze movement after 1984? So it seems to me Reagan's policy and Reagan's rhetoric had something to do with it. And I don't want to be reductionist. It's a complex issue. But certainly it seemed to me he was getting the better of the debate and influencing people. And you're right, we should separate rhetoric and policy. But you know what, rhetoric sometimes is policy, or at least it's policy in the minds of the people who hear the president. They don't know what's going on, in National Security Council meetings. And Reagan did, I would agree, I don't think this is a shift in substance. I think it is a shift in tone. But nonetheless, Reagan foregrounded his desire to meet with a Soviet leader, to reduce arms, to see the day when nuclear weapons vanish, in a way beginning with this speech, and maybe even a little bit before that. I certainly don't want to diminish the earlier instances of that, but it's a bigger part, and that, I think, does affect public perception. So even if you can't say in 1984 there's something to connect in Soviet-American relations and progress of the speech, I think it did help shape the environment in which policy is made and negotiations occur.
All right, well, now on to the fun part. Let's hear from some of the people in the audience. I see Susie. Why don't you go ahead and...
I have questions for all of you, but maybe I'll start by asking a question of Luke. And it's a two-parter. I wonder, first I would be curious to hear you talk about the role of someone you didn't mention at all in the administration's flexibility of its negotiating posture between 1981 and 1983, and that's George H.W. Bush, and the role he plays as vice president in both the public presentation and the formulation of policy. And then I would be curious if maybe you can distill into one or two sentences what you think is absolutely new about what you're saying. You contrasted yourself to the existing literature in a few different places, and I guess as part of the existing literature now, I am curious what you think is new.
Sure. So from what I found on Bush, the major role that Bush played was in presenting the shift in U.S. policy towards accepting an interim deal on INF when he travels in winter 1982 to 1983 to Europe. And as Richard Byrd said, they picked him in part because he was an American that Europeans could relate to. So I mean, perhaps you found more evidence of him as a policy advocate or someone who's really persuading Reagan to budge on the issue. But in my research, I mostly found him as sort of someone who's presenting the policies that are made in the Reagan administration. What's new about my research? I mean, other than the stuff that I put up on the slides, right? I think that the Reagan administration is more flexible and effective during this period. I think that it's been presented as Pearl and Weinberger are monopolizing U.S. INF policy, and I think I presented some very significant issues on which they're not getting their way. I think I'm also demonstrating that Reagan is setting the U.S. arms control agenda early on. I think that I'm suggesting that the zero option was a serious proposal. I mean, right, you had an immediate reaction when I suggested that Weinberger and Pearl were serious about it. That's an argument that's, I think, quite new. And in addition to that, I think I'm arguing that the deployment of U.S. missiles to Europe allows the INF negotiations to be successful from the Reagan administration's standpoint. They're the weapons that end up getting traded for the Soviet SS-20s. It's the gold standard of nuclear arms control agreements, and I really struggle to see how the United States could have ended up with that deal without deploying those missiles. So I think it's important to give the Reagan administration credit for achieving that goal during this period.
I see Nick. Was there another hand over here too, or no? I'm making that up. Okay, I see Nick. And Nick and then John.
One of the things that, and thank you for a wonderful panel, which was so interlocking, made it all the more enjoyable. One of the things that's also happening at this time is the Samantha Smith visit, where the little girl writes to Andropov, and he writes back in terms that are not dissimilar to the Reagan's story in the letter. And so I wonder if you could talk a bit about how that visit and a kind of a drama of an ordinary person being brought into superpower relations maybe mirrors Reagan's rhetorical strategy of imagine ordinary people being involved. And of course with David's paper, there's a drama acting out ordinary people as the victims of superpower behaviors. But the question I had for David was, how does this relate to the British drama Threads? And where does that fit into the whole business of imagining an apocalypse? Do you see Threads as magnifying the impact of the day after, or playing a parallel role, or how does those two works fit together?
Sure. Do you want to go first?
Well, I'll just comment briefly. I don't want to pretend to have expertise in Soviet Russian history, which I don't. But it seems to me what's going on both sides, particularly on the U.S. side, what I know, is some kind of contest for public opinion to get people to understand, just as the way the nuclear freeze movement would sort of simplify complex nuclear issues and say, just stop building. Who can not understand that? So it's all about getting people to believe that somehow governments are responsive, they understand current fears and concerns. It's not about throw weight and megatonnage and all those sort of complex things that people get, ordinary people, even experts get lost in easily enough. It's a way of saying we somehow are concerned about your security in a personal sense, not just in this sort of macro level. And for Reagan, it's easy. He didn't have that individual story. He had pen pals, but not somebody who that he could use for a nuclear story, for other things. So he invented those characters. But what Reagan was saying, and I tried to point out, in 1984 was really similar to what he was saying 3 years earlier. Reagan knew good stories. He had, Reagan's golden hits. Sometimes listening to Reagan is like listening to Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry had 15 gold hits out of 3 songs, and Reagan was good at that. So yeah, for him, that's how he works. If you can tell a story and if you can connect with a real person, even a fictional person who represents a real person, that's what success amounts to.
I might jump in on this one, Nick. So the use of Sam Smith is really interesting because she's a child. The Soviets are paying very close attention to children's psychological state in the United States. I think, David, or you'd mentioned the Physicians for Social Responsibility. Part of that group had gone over to Russia, done a number of psychological studies on Russian school children, and did a number of psychological studies on American school children, and found that American school children's psychological state, well, one, they still believed they could win a nuclear war, whereas the Russians were just much more fatalist. The kids were like, we're going to die, which could speak to other problems in the Soviet system. But two, so the Soviets. Well, I think it's an overstatement to say that the Freeze movement was dupes of the Soviets. And that if you look at the archives of C&D and Freeze and the other movements, they take great pains to avoid exchange with the Soviet activist fronts like World Peace Council. But what is not an overstatement is that the Soviets were very attuned to the methods that the anti-nuclear movements were using. And so they knew that the highlight of children's psychological fear of nuclear weapons was a real live issue, rather than it had been more about physical fear in the 60s. So playing on that issue was definitely, front of mind for the Kremlin.
So if I might tie in a few threads here. One of the more interesting debates that went on in the White House Office of Communications in response to cultivating the strategy to how to hijack the day after narrative was a series of at least 4 dozen suggestions, including many of the same practices that the Freeze movement had adopted, including asking school children to write postcards to the Soviet, to the head of the Soviet Union, to basically say, please come to the table for peace. So in many ways, there was an interesting debate within the own White House communication strategy about whether we should emulate some of these very successful seeming strategies by the freezeniks, as they describe them. In response to threads, the success of the day after was enormous around the world in every country but England. In fact, it was released theatrically almost a month after it aired here in a shorter format in Europe, timed with the arrival of the Pershing missiles, and it came second only to Empire Strikes Back in those markets. However, in the UK, it was summarily rejected because it did not adopt a partisan position, because it had not clearly articulated who had initiated the attack. It was perceived, therefore, as a kind of form of American propaganda to try to dissuade us away from the rampant fears that they had around the way that the U.S. had been operating within their theater, so to speak. So that was anticipating, of course, the release of Threads, which was a few months later after this movie aired. As a reminder, in theaters 3 weeks before the day after, the PBS-produced American Playhouse drama Testament had already played in theaters around the country, and just 6 months prior, War Games had come out. So there was this accumulative effect of these kind of anti-nuclear kind of narratives that culminated in this peak moment for American audiences around this movie. But in the UK, it played out in an extremely partisan way. The rogue publicist, who had not been hired by the network, nonetheless showed up and went public at promoting the film in the UK, and it actually backfired on them, where they were treated as these kind of studio apparatchiks, if you will, and trying to represent the studio interest, when in fact the studio, ABC, had threatened them with a lawsuit. So, yeah, it turned into a really interesting circumstance in the UK around this. And of course, now the precursor to Threads, of course, was the docudrama from 15 years earlier that BBC had produced and then shelved, but then got released in the U.S. and won the Academy Award for
The
Best.
War Game, Peter
Yeah,
Watkins,
Peter.
The War
Yeah,
Game.
which was without a doubt basically the screenplay for the film. But the Brits had never seen it, but it got released here and got the Academy Award for Best Documentary.
The War Game could be shown, it couldn't be shown on TV, but it could be shown at meetings. So it was a thing that you would see it at a CND meeting.
Right, so it gets slipped in
Yes.
under.
Yeah, no, so it was shown in a non-theatrical context rather than as a TV thing.
And I think I saw John and then someone and then Azrael.
So I'll stay on the day after real fast. Just on the question, and you brought it up also from 1984. In the construction of the movie, was there talk or reflection on the famous Daisy advertisement that Lyndon Johnson used in 1964? Where people think there'd be a connection. I mean, Dr. Strangelove may or may not have entered the conversation, but I was thinking about, they wanted to stay away from the weaponization of the movie for political purposes, and of course, and then there was that famous 1964 Daisy ad. So I was just curious if in your research.
Well, you can blame the researcher. In the 24 interviews that I conducted for the book, that never came up in the construction of it with the screenwriter or the producer. There were a lot of other fascinating tidbits that you'll find in the book. Did I just plug? I did. I did plug, like the question of EMPs, which had not at that moment been known in popular discourse, and the networks broadcasting standards wanted to take out the whole notion of EMPs because they couldn't prove it. Were some of the many variables. But I'll just say that in the history and the way in which these type of topics have been negotiated in the suites of networks and television, and in many instances the work that I was doing as a producer of TV movies as well, is that it was a point of constant negotiation. So for example, I made a movie about Flight 93 where we made the exact same choices to not show the politics, and we actually cut out a scene with generals in the film so that audiences were engaged more around the humanity that was occurring in order to raise greater awareness and appreciation and affective understanding. The politics, we felt, would pull people out of the story, even though as television producers we always knew that TV was the only book on the shelf.
Azrael?
I want to talk about Britain as a Brit, and also I want to suggest that maybe the idea of Reagan becoming more conciliatory, maybe that was something that didn't get through overseas, certainly not in the UK. Where I think Reagan was still seen as a hardliner. I can give you pop culture, so if we talk about pop culture, we talk about pop culture and also politics, but look at Sting, who came out in 1985 with his hit Russians. And he says, Mr. Reagan says we will protect you. I don't subscribe to that point of view. I hope that the Russians love their children too. It's sort of Reagan is almost seen as bad, not as bad as the Russians, but was still seen as a Cold War warrior. And of course, many on the left also Margaret Thatcher as a Cold War warrior. But certainly, it took a long time until certainly in well beyond 1983, Reagan was still seen as
The summer of '84. Sorry to jump in. Frankie Goes to Hollywood released
That's
Two
right.
Tribes,
Yeah.
where Reagan and Chernyenko are shown as wrestling.
Well, think of the Genesis video for Land of Confusion, which was done in
Yeah.
1986, which has Reagan pressing the wrong button, nuke instead of nurse. In this case, it's not so much that he intentionally wanted to blow up the world, he did it by accident, but it's still that image.
But also, even in the Tory government, then the Thatcher, Michael Heseltine, Geoffrey Howe, were up in arms about what Reagan was doing with SDI, and thought, deeply destabilizing. Not just, obviously part of the problem was that they saw it as a danger to Britain's nuclear deterrent, but also they were worried about what is he doing here? That he's scaring the Soviets, and it's deeply undermining the stability. So I don't think that certainly overseas, among NATO countries, there was a belief that Reagan was changing tack.
No, I think you're right. And then in addition to that, I'll add, Thatcher didn't want him to. Thatcher did not want the Soviets to accept the zero option because it was going to eliminate the missiles in Europe that she thought were needed to couple American and Soviet security. So in private, Thatcher is perfectly fine with the INF negotiations being deadlocked. She's going to say in public that she wants there to be progress in the talks. But I think that Reagan knows deep down that she's supporting the missile deployments, and that's more important to Reagan than British public opinion, which you're quite right to suggest would not have noticed these small policy changes and small examples of flexibility in negotiations, which I caveated went absolutely nowhere during this period. So yeah, it's a fair point, and it's a more accurate picture of the situation.
I think it's, you're right that images, I think we all know that Reagan's image in some ways with some groups, with some constituencies has changed rather slowly, in some cases not at all. But, while Reagan was trying to affect international public opinion as well as domestic public opinion, I think his primary international audience, or at least my research indicates this, was the Kremlin, that he wanted to speak to Soviet leaders. And I think it was kind of a revelation for him that any Soviet leader would fear the United States launching a first strike. And he wanted to get that message across. And so that's, I think, a really important part of the speech or the planning for it. And I may not have made that point as strongly as I did in the oral presentation, but I tried to emphasize it in the written paper.
If we have time for maybe one more question, if anyone is. Beth.
I have a comment rather than a question. Anthony's always so generous in plugging everybody else's scholarship, but he has just come out with a book, A Voice of Their Own.
Voice in Their Own Destiny.
Voice in Their Own Destiny, that is about the global nuclear freeze movement and the way in which it kind of forced the Thatcher government. And there you go. Yeah.